In the bitter winter of 1347, as snow fell thick upon the English countryside, two souls were about to discover that compassion and cruelty can exist within the same stone walls, separated by nothing more than a great hall and the weight of tradition. Welcome, dear friend, to a story meant to drift you gently towards sleep, where we will walk together through the frost and candlelight of a long-ago Christmas, and learn what it means to hold onto hope when the world grows dark and cold. In a village nestled in the Yorkshire moorlands, where the stone walls of the manor house rose like a testament to centuries of power, there lived a girl named Gwen. She was 17 years old, though the bone weariness in her movements made her seem much older. Her skin was pale as birch bark, stretched thin across a face that must have been delicate once, before hunger became her constant companion. Her eyes were a peculiar gray-blue, like frost gathering on morning grass, and they held a quality of careful watchfulness that came from living too long with too little. Her hair, when she could afford to keep it clean, was the color of dark honey, but it had been so long since she'd had water warm enough and time enough to wash it properly that it hung in a matted plait down her spine, tucked beneath the faded linen wimple that marked her as an unmarried girl of the village. Gwen lived in a cottage at the edge of the manor's lands, a small structure of wattle and daub with a thatched roof that leaked in roughly 17 different places, though she had given up counting after the first dozen. The cottage had belonged to her father, who had worked the strips of land that belonged to Lord Ashford for his entire life. Her father's hands had been enormous, scarred and strong, weathered by decades of plowing and sowing and reaping. Gwen remembered sitting on his knee when she was small, tracing the ridges of scars on his palms, and he would tell her stories about the crops, about how you could read the earth like a book if you knew its language. He had taught her the language, though it was a language that spoke mostly of struggle and uncertainty. Her father had died 3 years ago when Gwen was 14, worn out from a fever that had swept through the village in the spring of 1344. She remembered the smell of the sick room, the heat of his skin despite the cold cottage, the way his eyes had looked at her in those final hours with a love so fierce it had nearly broken her apart even then. He had squeezed her hand and whispered that she must be strong, that the land would provide if she was clever and careful, that she must never lose her kindness even when the world gave her reason to. Then he had closed his eyes and had not opened them again. Her mother had passed 5 years before that, after giving birth to a stillborn son. Gwen had been only 12 then, still young enough to believe that death was something that happened to other people, to people far away, not to mothers who braided your hair and taught you to make bread. But it had happened, and it had happened quickly, in the way that death often does. Her mother's scream was the last sound Gwen had heard her make. She had been sent away with the other children while the midwife worked, and when she returned, her mother was already gone, her body still warm beneath the thin blanket, but her spirit already departed to whatever lay beyond. So Gwen had learned early that the world was not kind, that love was not enough to protect you, that grief came like winter and stayed longer than you wanted it to. After her father died, she had become the sole tenant of the cottage, which meant she owed Lord Ashford 3 days of labor each week, plus the rent of half her produce from the small strips of land that came with the cottage. It also meant she was largely alone, with no family to support her and no prospects of marriage, because what man wanted a girl with no dowry and no family to bring him advantage? The cottage itself was sparse. Against the far wall stood a narrow cot with a straw mattress and 2 thin blankets, both so worn that you could see through them in places. There was a small hearth where she kept a fire burning when she could afford peat or dried dung, which wasn't often. A wooden table with 3 legs and a stone, smoothed by hand, that served as a fourth. 2 stools. A shelf holding her few possessions. A wooden bowl, a cup, 2 spoons, a knife that her father had given her, and a candle that she lit only on the holiest of nights because tallow was expensive and she could not afford much of it. The walls were bare except for the mud and straw that composed them, and where they had begun to crack, wind came through in thin, bitter streams that made her huddle closer to the fire. She had stuffed rags into the largest cracks, but they did little good when the winter wind gusted. Outside the cottage was a small vegetable garden where she grew what she could: turnips, onions, and a few beans when the season permitted. This year has been particularly cruel to the garden. Summer had brought a blight, and autumn had come early and harsh. The turnips were smaller than usual, shriveled things that gave less sustenance than they had in previous years. The onions had rotted in the damp soil. The beans had never come in properly. So now in December, as Christmas approached, her stores were meager. She had perhaps 4 weeks of food if she rationed carefully, if she didn't give in to hunger too often, if the grain she had bartered for from the mill held through the winter months. The village itself was a small place, perhaps 40 families at last count, though 2 had died of fever the previous year and had not been replaced. The church stood at its heart, a sturdy stone building with a bell tower that rang for services and for death. The manor house loomed above the village, stone and timber and glass, impossibly grand to Gwen's eyes, though she knew Lord Ashford's wealth was modest compared to the great nobles of the realm. Still, the manor was a palace by comparison to the cottages where the villagers lived. She had been inside it only twice. Once when her father had brought her as a small child for some reason she could no longer remember, and once just last year when she had had to appear before the steward regarding a boundary dispute with old Tom's fields. The manor kitchen was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. It was larger than her entire cottage, with great stone ovens and a fire pit you could stand inside. There were copper pots hanging from iron hooks, and storage rooms filled with cheeses and dried meats, and sacks of grain stacked so high you had to crane your neck to see the top. She had stood there for what seemed like hours, terrified and amazed, while the steward consulted his records and eventually ruled against her, giving those few extra feet of land to Tom, because Tom had been born in the village and Gwen's father had been born 2 villages away, and therefore had less claim to the land than a man whose ancestors had worked it for unknown generations. Lord Ashford himself she had seen in passing, riding on his horse through the village, usually hunting with his hawks or riding to some neighboring lord's manor. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, with a face that had once been handsome but had begun to go fat and drink. His wife had died 6 years ago, and he had never remarried, though there were whispers that he had taken a mistress from among the more substantial families in the area. He had 2 sons and a daughter by his late wife, all of whom lived with relatives in London to receive a proper education, the sort of education that Gwen could barely imagine. She had heard it said that his eldest son was training to be a knight, that his daughter was betrothed to a baron's son, that his youngest boy was destined for the church. These sons and daughters lived in a world utterly separate from Gwen's world. They were of the nobility or near enough to it, and she was a peasant, a tenant, a subject. The gulf between them was as vast as the gulf between the earth and the sky. Yet they shared the same village, the same land, the same sun and moon and stars. The inequality of it was so obvious, so built into the very stones of the manor and the fabric of society, that no one questioned it. It was God's order, the priest said, that some were born to rule and others to serve. It was natural as breathing, as unquestionable as the cycle of seasons. But this Christmas season of 1347 was different in ways that Gwen could sense but not yet fully articulate. There had been whispers of trouble to the south, in the merchant ships arriving at the ports, strange illness, entire crews dying in days, the great mortality, they were calling it, the pestilence. But these reports came from London, from Southampton, from distant places that seemed as far away as the sun. Surely it would not come here. Surely the village would be spared. For now, Gwen was focused on the immediate reality of her hunger and the coming cold. It was early December, and the first real snows had already begun to fall. The nights dropped below freezing. The day before yesterday, she had woken to find ice forming on the inside of her cottage walls, delicate ferns of crystal that caught what little light came through the smoke hole in the roof. She had breathed on it, watching it momentarily shine with the warmth of her breath before freezing again. Her work for Lord Ashford had been light these past weeks, which was both a blessing and a curse. There were no fields to tend in winter, so instead her 3 days of labor each week had been redistributed. 1 day was spent in the manor's kitchens, helping with the preparation of food and the cleaning of pots. 1 day was spent mending clothing or weaving cloth. 1 day was spent on whatever task the steward deemed necessary, mucking out the stables, hauling water, stacking firewood. But this close to Christmas, the manor was beginning to prepare for the great feast that Lord Ashford always held, the feast that was part of his obligation to his tenants, part of the complex web of reciprocal duties that bound lord and peasant together. Or at least, that was how the priest framed it in his sermons. In reality, Gwen knew, it was mostly about Lord Ashford displaying his wealth and power to his peers and his tenants, reminding everyone that he was capable of conspicuous consumption, that he could afford to be generous, that his position was unassailable. The Christmas feast was a tradition stretching back generations. Every villager in Lord Ashford's domain was entitled to a share of a great meal in the manor hall on Christmas Day. It was a day when the normal order of things was temporarily suspended. The Lord sat at the high table with his peers and important guests, and the villagers sat together on long benches, eating meat that they could not afford during the rest of the year, drinking ale freely, warming themselves by the great hearth fire. It was a day of celebration and relief, a day when hunger retreated for a few hours, a day that the village talked about for weeks afterward. Gwen had attended the feast since she was old enough to walk. She had memories of sitting between her parents, feeling very small and overwhelmed by the noise and the crowds and the abundance. She remembered her father's hand on her shoulder, protective and warm. She remembered the taste of roasted fowl, the richness of it strange on her tongue, accustomed as it was to thin gruel and hard bread. She remembered the smell of spiced wine, the sound of pipes and drums, the rare sight of people from the village dancing in the great hall, their normal dignity abandoned in the joy of the moment. But that had been when her parents were alive, when she still had some sense of security, however fragile. Since then, the feasts had become more bittersweet. She still attended, of course. Everyone did. But she was always conscious of being alone, of being the only one without a family beside her, of being the girl whose parents were dead, the girl everyone pitied a little and were also slightly wary of, as if death might be contagious, as if standing near her might transfer her bad fortune. This year's Christmas would be no different, she assumed. She would go to the feast. She would eat her portion of meat and bread. She would sit quietly at one of the long tables. She would thank the Lord for his generosity when the priest offered the blessing, and she would return to her cold cottage to resume the daily business of survival. She would count the days until spring, when the work in the fields would resume, when the rhythm of sowing and tending would fill her hours and give her some sense of purpose beyond mere endurance. But Gwen was someone who, despite everything, still held onto a secret corner of hope in her heart. Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps it was the remnant of childhood, a belief in the possibility of change and kindness that she should have outgrown by now. But she held it nonetheless. Sometimes, when the cold was most bitter and her belly was most empty, she would sit by the fire in her cottage and imagine a different life. Not a life of wealth or grand estates. She was not so foolish as to imagine that, but a life where she had enough, where she didn't have to plan every meal, every bit of fuel, every second of work, where she might have a little kindness extended to her that was not born of obligation or charity, but of genuine human connection, where she might know, even for a moment, what it felt like to be truly warm. She did not know yet that this Christmas would be the turning point of her life, that the choices she would make in the coming weeks would reverberate through her entire future. She did not know about the events that were even now unfolding across the channel, events that would eventually reach the shores of England and transform everything. She did not know that compassion and cruelty would walk through her life side by side, wearing different faces, speaking different languages, yet both utterly real and utterly consequential. For now, she was simply Gwen, a 17-year-old girl in a cold cottage, waiting for Christmas, trying not to think too much about hunger, trying to be brave the way her father had asked her to be, trying to believe that kindness still mattered in a world that had shown her precious little of it. The snow was falling outside her cottage, soft and white and relentless, and she sat by her meager fire, mending a tear in her only spare tunic, and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be warm. 2 miles away, in the stone warmth of the manor house, another story was unfolding in a different register altogether. In the grand chamber that served as Lord Ashford's private solar, a man sat at a large oak table, surrounded by accounts and ledgers, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. This was Edmund Ashford, the lord of these lands, a man of 43 years whose face still held traces of the handsome young knight he had once been, though his jawline had softened with age, and his eyes had grown weary with the burden of management and the numbing repetition of small decisions that never quite resolved themselves into larger satisfactions. Edmund had been born to these lands, the second son of a man of modest importance. He had not expected to inherit. His elder brother had been groomed for it, had been trained in warfare and governance, had been betrothed to the daughter of a neighboring lord in a match meant to strengthen their family's position. But his elder brother had died at the age of 23, struck down by a sudden flux that no physician could arrest. Edmund had been 17, training in the household of a distant knight, learning the arts of combat and courtly behavior, when the messenger had arrived with the news. Within a month, he had been recalled to the manor to assume his unexpected inheritance. He had been unprepared for it in every way that mattered. He was too young, too temperamentally unsuited to the constant calculations of agriculture and economy. He was more suited to poetry and music than to the grim mathematics of crop yields and tax collection. He had taken a bride as was expected of him, a gentle woman named Catherine whose family brought a modest dowry and useful connections. They had had 3 children together, Edward, who was now 15 and training with a knight in the south, Margaret, who was 13 and betrothed to a boy she had never met, and Thomas, who was 11 and was meant for the church, though he showed more talent for mischief than for piety. Catherine had died 6 years ago in childbirth, after a fever came following the birth of a stillborn daughter. Edmund had held her hand through the fever and through the delirium and through the long decline into death, just as she was giving birth to the child that would not live. He had watched her slip away from him, back toward some realm he could not follow. He had been 37 years old then, and in that moment, he had felt the weight of every moment of his entire life settle onto his shoulders like a great cloak of stone. After her death, he had lost interest in remarrying, despite the pressure from his father-in-law and his peers. He had taken a mistress eventually, a widow named Joan whose husband had died in some minor skirmish, and she had given him the attention and physical comfort that he lacked, but there was no real love in it, and he knew it as well as she did. The accounting books before him were the current source of his distress. The harvest this year had been disappointing, worse than he had initially thought when the grain had been brought in. The crop yield was nearly 20% below what it should have been. This meant less grain to sell, less revenue, less flexibility in his accounts. He owed money to a creditor in York, a wealthy merchant named Bartholomew, who had advanced him funds for the repair of the manor's roof 3 years ago. The debt was not enormous, but it was regular, and it nibbled at his reserves month after month. Beyond the financial troubles, there was the matter of his daughter's betrothal. The match had been arranged 3 years ago, when Margaret was a child of 10, in a political alliance that had seemed advantageous at the time. The boy's father was a baron, a man of considerable power in the north. But recent reports had suggested that the baron's fortunes were declining, that his influence at court had waned, that perhaps the marriage would not bring the advantage Edmund had hoped for. Yet it was too late to withdraw without giving offense, and he could not afford to alienate a baron, even a declining one. So Margaret's future was fixed, set in stone like the walls of the manor, and there was nothing to be done about it. Edmund set down his quill and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He was tired. He was always tired these days. The burden of the manor, the endless small responsibilities, the constant awareness that his decisions affected not just himself but 40 families, 200 souls or more in the village and the lands around it. It pressed down on him constantly. There were days when he wished he could simply walk away, disappear into the forest like a character in a romance, and become someone else entirely. But he could not do that. He was Lord Ashford, and that identity had worn itself into his bones so thoroughly that he could not imagine separating himself from it. It was who he was, for better or worse. He had given orders for the Christmas feast to proceed as always. It was tradition, and traditions were the only thing that held society together, the only thing that prevented the chaos that threatened at the edges of civilization. Besides, the feast was relatively inexpensive when you considered it properly. He could afford to kill 3 sheep and half a dozen geese, could afford to serve bread and ale to his tenants, could afford to hire a minstrel from the next town over to play pipes and drums. These things cost money, yes, but less money than it would cost if he failed to hold the feast, and thereby violated the compact that bound lord to tenant. The peasants expected it. They had come to rely upon it. And in a way, Edmund had come to rely upon it as well, upon the one day of the year when he could feel himself doing something noble, something genuinely generous, something that was not about money or politics or the endless calculations of survival. The steward had mentioned to him that one of the girls from the village, a tenant farmer's daughter named Gwen, if Edmund's weary memory served, had come to his attention because of her exceptional industry. She worked her 3 days faithfully and without complaint, the steward said. She had turned out several bolts of very fine cloth when assigned to weaving. She had organized the kitchen with such efficiency that the cook had remarked on it. She was quiet, kept to herself, but was not slack or disobedient. The steward had mentioned this almost in passing, as if nodding an interesting detail about a particularly obedient horse or a well-trained dog. Edmund had nodded absently at the time, but the comment had lodged itself in his mind in an odd way. He found himself thinking of it now, as he sat in the dim afternoon light, filtering through the narrow windows of his solar. There was something in the steward's tone that suggested an awareness of the girl's singular situation. The fact that she was alone, that she had no family to speak of, that she was vulnerable in ways that the other tenants, surrounded by the support of kinship networks, were not. Edmund wondered if the steward meant for him to do something about it, or if the mention was simply a note about a conscientious worker, offered with no deeper implication. Edmund was a man who had learned, over the years of his lordship, to read between the lines of what people said to him. People rarely spoke to him directly. They spoke around him, around the authority he represented, around the power he held over their lives. The steward was a canny man, one who had served Edmund's father before him, and had kept the affairs of the manor running with a steadiness that Edmund often envied. If the steward had mentioned the girl, there was a reason for it. He rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out over the snow-covered lands that belonged to him. The village was just visible through the white haze, lights beginning to twinkle as candles were lit against the coming darkness. He thought of the cottages where his tenants lived, the small dark places where families huddled around meager fires, where they stretched their resources as thin as they would go to make it through the winter. He thought of the disparity between his world and theirs, the gulf that was so absolute that it barely seemed to register anymore. They lived in a separate realm, almost a separate world, one that operated by different rules, where survival was not guaranteed and where a bad harvest meant real suffering. He had been born into this position of privilege. He had not earned it through any exceptional virtue or talent. He simply had the good fortune of being born the son of a lord, and then the further good fortune of his elder brother dying and leaving the position to him. And yet he wielded power over these people, made decisions that shaped their lives, extracted their labor and their deference, all because of an accident of birth. Sometimes Edmund wondered if God would hold him accountable for this. The priest assured him that his position was God's will, that he was meant to rule, that his responsibility was to rule justly and generously, and that if he did so, he would find himself welcomed into heaven. Edmund was not a particularly religious man, but neither was he entirely faithless. He hedged his bets by being moderately generous, by not demanding more than his due, by attempting to rule with at least a veneer of justice. It was probably enough, he thought. It had to be enough. He turned away from the window and moved toward the door of his solar, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Tomorrow he will inspect the preparations for the Christmas feast. He would look at the meat being salted, check on the quantities of grain and bread being prepared, ensure that things were proceeding according to the scale he expected. It would be a fine feast, a generous feast, a feast that would remind everyone of his benevolence and his power in equal measure. The tenants would eat well for one day, and they would remember it through the hungry weeks of winter, and they would owe him more than they had before, which was exactly as it should be. And yet, as he descended the stone stairs toward the great hall, Edmund found his mind returning, unbidden, to the image of a girl whose name he was not even entirely certain he had gotten right. A girl who worked hard and kept quiet and was all alone in the world. A girl who was probably at this very moment sitting in a cold cottage and dreaming of the one warm meal that the Christmas feast would provide. He did not know and could not have known that this thought was a seed. He did not know that in the coming days, this seed would grow into a decision that would change everything. He did not know that he was already beginning to awaken from the long sleep of privilege that had insulated him from the reality of other people's suffering. He did not know that his carefully ordered world was about to be shaken by forces beyond his control, and that when it was, he would find himself reaching out toward that girl and her story, seeking in it something that he could not articulate, something that had to do with redemption and meaning, and the possibility that his life might matter for reasons beyond the accident of his birth. For now, he was simply Edmund Ashford, lord of these lands, a man of middle age and modest wealth, walking through the corridors of his manor house as evening fell, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The manor smelled of wood smoke and old stone, and the food being prepared in the kitchens. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear servants moving about, voices calling instructions, the ordinary sounds of a household preparing for a great feast. And somewhere out in the village, in a small cottage barely visible through the snow, a girl was sitting by a fire, mending a tear in her tunic, and allowing herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be warm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and white, and utterly indifferent to the hopes and fears of the two souls whose stories were about to intertwine in ways that neither of them could have predicted. Winter deepened around them both, closing in like a long, slow breath, and Christmas drew ever closer, bringing with it the possibility of change, of grace, of the small miracles that sometimes happen when people are broken enough to need them. The next morning, Gwen woke before dawn as she always did. Her body did not require an alarm. It had learned the rhythm of survival so thoroughly that it simply opened her eyes when the time came to begin the day. She lay for a moment under her thin blankets, gathering the courage to leave their slight warmth and face the bitter cold of her cottage. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faintest glow from the banked fire, which she had carefully maintained through the night, keeping it alive on the smallest possible amount of fuel. She could see her breath in the darkness, small clouds of warmth rising and dispersing into the frigid air. Her toes were numb. Her fingers were curled into fists against the cold. This was the worst time of day, the moment of transition between sleep and waking, when the body's slow metabolism could no longer sustain the illusion of warmth, and the mind was forced to confront the reality of the day ahead. She counted slowly to 20, a trick she had learned over the years to make the transition easier. By the time she reached 20, her eyes had adjusted enough to the darkness that she could make out the shapes of the cottage around her. The table, the stools, the shelf with her few possessions, the door that needed repair. She threw back the blankets, moving quickly before she could reconsider, and her body seized in immediate protest against the cold. She was wearing the same clothing she had worn the day before, a shift of linen that had been mended so many times that there was more mending than original cloth, a dress of dark wool, worn at the hem and thin at the elbows, and over that a shawl that had belonged to her mother, so ancient and threadbare that it barely qualified as clothing anymore. She added these layers as she moved, her movements efficient and practiced, the movements of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. Her fingers were too stiff to fasten the ties properly, so she simply wrapped everything around herself as best she could. The shawl she pinned with a wooden brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, one of her few possessions that had no practical purpose, existed only because it was beautiful. She looked at it sometimes and wondered at what point beauty became a luxury that the poor could not afford. She kept the brooch anyway, tucked it away carefully, wore it on special occasions, and felt a small thrill each time she fastened it, a small rebellion against the grinding uniformity of her poverty. She went to the fire and knelt before it, blowing gently on the banked coals until they glowed orange-red and small flames began to lick upward. She added a few sticks of wood from her precious pile, wood she had gathered bit by bit through the autumn, pieces she had found in the forest or been given by the steward when trees had been felled. She was careful with the wood, never taking more than she absolutely needed. A fire that went out in winter was a serious problem. Without it, she had no way to cook, no way to heat water, no way to warm herself. Starting a new fire meant finding flint and steel and dry tinder, a process that could take an hour and involve considerable frustration and effort. The fire caught and grew, and Gwen held her hands before it, spreading her fingers to let the warmth penetrate all the way through them. The feeling was almost unbearable at first, the warmth bringing a sharp pain to her cold, stiffened joints, and she closed her eyes and simply endured it, waiting for the pain to transform into something approaching comfort. This was how she greeted the cold every morning, through this small ritual of fire and physical pain, and the stubborn insistence on survival. Once her hands were sufficiently warm that she could use them properly, she moved to the small bucket near the door, where water had frozen solid overnight. She had filled the bucket the evening before from the well at the edge of the village, and it had frozen as she was bringing it back to the cottage. She used her knife to chip out a small amount of ice, which she placed in a pot and set on the fire to melt. This would be her breakfast: warm water, perhaps with a bit of bread if she could afford it, and maybe an onion to flavor it if she still had any that had not rotted. The thought of warm food steadied her somehow. It was a small thing, but it mattered. While the water melted, she moved to the door and opened it a crack, peering out at the village. The snow was falling still, thick wet flakes that stuck to everything, transforming the world into a landscape of white and gray. The sky was the color of lead, pressing down, and the temperature had actually risen slightly in the night, which meant it would be even colder by evening. She could see smoke rising from the chimneys of the other cottages, see people moving about their morning routines, their figures bent against the cold. The village had a morning time quality to it, the world still gray, not quite awake. She knew what day it was because she kept careful track, marking days by making small scratches on a piece of wood that hung behind her door. It was the 11th of December, 14 days until Christmas. 2 weeks in which she had to survive on her carefully rationed stores, 2 weeks in which the work required of her would continue regardless of the cold. 2 weeks in which she had to hold onto the hope that the feast at the end of it would be as generous as it had been in past years. But this year felt different somehow. There was a tension in the air, a sense of something shifting. The past few days, she had heard whispers among the other tenants about the great mortality coming from the south. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might attract its attention. Some said it was a judgment from God for the sins of mankind. Others said it was a natural imbalance in the humors, brought on by the alignment of planets. A few, the more learned folk, speculated that it was connected to the earthquakes that had been reported from far away, that perhaps the earth itself was sick and the sickness was spreading through the air. Gwen did not know what to think about it. The idea of a distant plague seemed both impossibly real and impossibly unreal. Certainly, illness was a constant presence in the village. People got sick. People died. That was simply the nature of life. But they always had, in the natural way of things. The idea of a sickness so powerful that it could kill entire families, entire villages, seemed like something from a tale, something that happened in distant lands, not something that could reach into Yorkshire and touch the people she knew. Still, there was something in the way people spoke about it that made her uneasy. There was a note of fear beneath the speculation, a note of something that felt like an awareness that the normal rules might not hold, that the world they thought they understood might not be as stable as they had believed. The water had begun to steam now. Gwen retrieved her only pot and lifted it carefully from the fire. She used her shawl as a makeshift cloth to protect her hands from the heat, and she poured the water into her wooden bowl. She reached to the shelf where she kept her stores and pulled down a small piece of hard bread, a piece she had been saving for a morning when she particularly needed it. This morning felt like it qualified. She crumbled the bread into the hot water and let it soften for a moment. Then she added salt, precious salt that cost money, that she used sparingly, and just a tiny pinch of dried thyme from her store. The smell rose with the steam, and for just a moment she could almost imagine she was eating something rich and nourishing rather than bread softened in hot water. She sat on one of her stools and cradled the bowl in her hands, eating slowly, savoring each bite, letting the warmth of the food spread through her. This was her breakfast most mornings, though sometimes the bread was moldy and she had to pick out the green parts before eating, and sometimes she could not afford the salt or the thyme and simply ate the warm water with the bread. This morning, with the salt and the herb, it was almost luxurious. She ate it all, scraping the bowl clean with a bit of bread, ensuring that she wasted nothing. By the time she had finished, dawn was breaking. The gray sky was becoming lighter, still heavy with the promise of more snow, but light enough that she could see properly without the fire. She needed to be at the manor by the time the bell rang for the first work period, which would be shortly after full light. Today was one of her work days. According to the steward's rotation, she was assigned to the kitchens. The walk to the manor took perhaps 15 minutes, longer in this snow, with her boots slipping in the drifts. The road was rutted from the passage of carts and livestock, and the snow had filled the ruts, creating a landscape of small hills and valleys that her feet had to navigate carefully. She walked with her head down, watching for the icy patches that could send her sprawling. Other villagers were on the road as well, people heading to the manor or to other work, their breath frosting in the cold air, their movements quick and purposeful, driven by the knowledge that standing around in this cold was dangerous. She arrived at the manor as the bell was ringing, pulling off her shawl to hang it with the other cloaks in the small room just inside the kitchen door. Her hair, when she unwound it from beneath the wimple, was flat and somewhat greasy. She knew she looked unkempt, and she was grateful that the kitchen was too busy during the day for anyone to pay much attention to how the workers looked. As long as they worked efficiently and did not waste food, the cook did not seem to care much what condition they arrived in. The manor kitchen was a cavernous space in the morning light, full of activity and noise. The cook, a fat man named Oswin who ruled his domain with a combination of sharp words and occasional genuine kindness, was directing a stream of workers, both permanent household staff and day workers like Gwen, through a series of tasks. There was meat to be prepared, a great haunch of venison that had been hanging in the cold storage, waiting to be butchered for the upcoming feast. There were vegetables to be cleaned and cut. There were pots to be scoured, water to be hauled from the well, fires to be tended. Oswin took one look at Gwen when she entered and nodded toward a pile of turnips. "Those need cleaning and cutting," he said. "The Christmas feast requires vegetables as well as meat. And try not to waste any of them. They cost money, unlike some of the folk around here." He said this last part loud enough that several of the other workers looked up, and Gwen realized he was making a joke, probably at the expense of one of the permanent staff who was not present at the moment. Oswin's humor was often cruel, but it was a cruelty that seemed almost playful, an extension of his personality rather than a genuine malice. Gwen set to work without being asked to do more. She found a knife, a sharp one, better than the worn blade she had at home, and began cleaning the turnips, scraping away the dirt, cutting out any soft spots or rot. The turnips this year were smaller than usual, another sign of the poor harvest. Some of them had that woody quality that meant they had been in storage too long, that their sugars had turned to starch, and they had become mealy and less pleasant to eat. But they would still be useful, still nourishing. Nothing was wasted in the kitchen. Even the peelings would be saved for the pigs or for stock. As she worked, she became aware of a commotion in the upper reaches of the kitchen. The steward was there, conferring with Oswin about something, their voices low but intent. Gwen tried not to pay attention, but she caught fragments of the conversation. Lord Ashford's orders, more substantial portions, not as usual, special consideration. She wondered what they were discussing, whether it affected the feast, whether there would be more food or less. She did not let herself hope for more. Hope was a luxury that too often led to disappointment. The day proceeded in the rhythmic way of kitchen work. She moved from task to task, her hands becoming raw from the cold water and the work, her back growing stiff from bending over the table. Around midday, One of the permanent kitchen staff brought out bread and a small portion of pottage for the workers to eat. Gwen ate her portion quickly, grateful for the warmth and the substance of it. The pottage was thick and hearty, made with beans and vegetables and a bit of meat, far more generous than what she could make for herself at home. It was as she was wiping her bowl clean that she heard Oswin mention her name. He was speaking to the steward, his voice carrying across the kitchen. "That one there, Gwen, the tenant farmer's daughter. She's a steady worker, good with her hands and doesn't complain. Keeps to herself, but she works hard. You should mark her if you haven't already." The steward, a thin man with narrow eyes and a perpetually suspicious expression, nodded slowly. "I have marked her," he said. "I noticed her myself. The Lord was interested when I mentioned her efficiency with the weaving." Gwen's hands went very still. The Lord had been interested in her. She did not know what to make of this information. It was unusual for the Lord to notice individual workers at all, let alone to express interest in them. She was a cipher to him, one of dozens of tenants barely worth nodding. The idea that she had come to his attention in any way was unsettling. It could be a good thing. It could also be something to worry about. She finished her work for the day as the light was fading from the windows. The kitchen was already preparing for the next day. The great hearth fires burned low, the main work of the day finished. Oswin released the day workers with a wave, telling them to come back tomorrow if they wanted more work. Gwen collected her shawl and began the walk back to her cottage, her mind turning over what she had overheard, trying to divine its meaning. The snow had stopped, and the temperature had dropped significantly. Her breath froze almost as soon as it left her mouth, creating temporary clouds of ice crystals that dissipated into the darkness. The village was beginning to settle in for the night, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of animals being secured for the evening. The church bell rang the hour, a deep sound that carried across the frozen landscape. When she reached her cottage, Gwen found a small bundle sitting on her doorstep, carefully placed so that it would not blow away. She looked around to see if anyone was nearby, but the street was empty. She retrieved the bundle. It was wrapped in a clean cloth, and brought it inside, setting it on her table in the light of her fire. Carefully, she unwrapped it. Inside were three things: a wheel of cheese, a small loaf of fine white bread, and a packet wrapped in paper that proved to contain several pieces of dried fruit, apples and pears, luxuries she had not eaten in months. There was no note, no indication of who had left them, but the presentation was careful, deliberate. This was not accidental. Someone had gone out of their way to give her these things. Gwen sat down slowly on one of her stools, staring at the food before her. Her heart was pounding. She was frightened and confused, and something else too, something that felt almost like hope, though she had learned long ago that hope was dangerous. She looked at the food, at the fine cloth it had been wrapped in, at the obvious care that had gone into the selection. Someone knew who she was. Someone had noticed her. Someone, for reasons she could not fathom, had decided to be kind to her. She took a piece of the cheese and ate it slowly, cautiously, as if it might vanish if she was not careful. The taste was rich and complex, so different from the hard, simple cheese she occasionally traded for that she almost felt as though she was eating something magical. She ate a bit of the white bread as well, tasting the butter that had been worked into it, sensing the care and skill that had gone into its making. Then she wrapped everything back up in the cloth and hid it carefully behind a loose stone in her cottage wall, a hiding place she had discovered months ago and had kept secret, using it to store the few things she possessed that had no practical purpose. Her grandmother's brooch, a scrap of cloth that her mother had loved, a smooth stone she had picked up years ago from a stream. All night, Gwen lay awake in her bed, thinking about the food, about who might have left it, about what it might mean. The most likely explanation was that it was a mistake, that the steward or one of the kitchen workers had meant it for someone else, and it had been delivered to her by accident. But even as she thought this, she did not quite believe it. Mistakes of this magnitude, this carefully bundled and placed, did not seem like accidents. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the wind outside her cottage and feeling the gradual warmth of her body under the blankets, she allowed herself to imagine something she had not imagined in a very long time, that there was goodness in the world, that kindness could come without obligation or payment, that someone might care about her simply because she was a person worthy of caring about. It was a dangerous thought, she knew. It was the thought of a fool, but she held onto it anyway, clutching it like the cheese and bread she had wrapped carefully and hidden away. In the morning, she thought, she would eat a small piece of the fruit, and she would feel for a few hours like a person who was noticed, who mattered, who was not entirely alone in the world. Meanwhile, in the manor house, Edmund Ashford stood in the great hall and surveyed the preparations for the Christmas feast with an uncharacteristic attention to detail. The steward had arranged everything according to the usual specifications, and it was all exactly as it should be. Tables being set up, the great hearth fire being prepared, decorations of greenery and holly beginning to appear in the corners and along the walls. Yet something in Edmund's mind kept circling back to his conversation with the steward earlier in the day, to his own unspoken impulse, to the small decision he had made before he fully understood his own reasoning. He had sent the steward to the kitchen with a simple instruction: select the finest items from the feast preparations, items that would not be missed, and have them carefully wrapped and delivered to the cottage of the tenant farmer's daughter, the one named Gwen. The steward had looked at him with barely concealed surprise, had opened his mouth as if to ask for clarification, and then had closed it again, recognizing that the Lord's orders did not require explanation. He had simply nodded and gone about the task. Edmund had not examined too closely why he had made this decision. He could tell himself that it was practical benevolence, that it was wise lordship to ensure that his more conscientious workers were adequately fed, and therefore more capable of good work. He could tell himself that it was part of the Christmas season's call to charity, that even the wealthy were supposed to remember the poor at this time of year. He could tell himself many things, and he did tell himself these things, but beneath all of them was something else, something less rational and more compelling, a simple sense that it was the right thing to do. Edmund had spent his life doing the right thing, or at least attempting to do so. He had been raised by a pious father who had taught him that duty and honor were the foundations of a good life, that a man's worth was measured by how faithfully he performed the obligations of his station. Edmund had internalized these lessons thoroughly enough that they had become almost second nature, a quiet voice in the back of his mind that judged his actions against a standard of righteousness that was probably impossible to actually meet, but that drove him nonetheless to attempt the impossible. But this impulse toward Gwen felt different from his normal sense of duty. It did not come from obligation or tradition or the weight of expectation. It came from something simpler and perhaps more dangerous. It came from empathy. It came from the sudden, visceral awareness that there was a human being in the village below his manor, a person with an inner life as complex as his own, with fears and hopes and dreams that he could barely imagine, and that this person was suffering in ways that his comfort had partially caused, simply by virtue of the fact that he was born to power and she was born to powerlessness. This awareness was uncomfortable. Edmund had spent most of his life managing to ignore it, or at least to manage it in ways that fit within the established order of things. He paid his taxes to the church. He gave alms when appropriate. He held the Christmas feast. He ruled with a hand that was at least generally perceived as just, if not particularly warm. He did not, however, typically concern himself with the individual suffering of his tenants. That was an indulgence he could not afford, either emotionally or practically. If he began to feel too acutely the suffering of others, he would be paralyzed by guilt and the impossible task of trying to alleviate the suffering of hundreds of people who had very little and needed very much. And yet, here was this girl, this Gwen, who had somehow lodged herself in his mind, and with her had come the uncomfortable awareness that his comfortable existence was built on the backs of people whose existence was far less comfortable. It was not a new awareness. He knew this intellectually. But there was a difference between intellectual knowledge and emotional recognition, and somewhere in the last day, the knowledge had transformed into recognition. He had given no thought to what Gwen would think when she received the food, what she would make of it, whether she would be grateful or frightened or suspicious. He had simply acted on the impulse, assuming that food would be received as a gift rather than as something more complicated. It did not occur to him until much later that the receipt of such a gift might actually be troubling to someone in Gwen's position, that it might raise questions she had no way of answering, that it might create obligations or expectations that she did not want to have placed upon her. Edmund was a man of privilege in every possible way, and one of the privileges of his position was the ability to act on his impulses without having to consider very carefully what the consequences of those actions might be for people less powerful than himself. It was simply the way the world worked. A lord gave, and the peasants received, and there was gratitude and obligation, and the world continued on its ordained path. It was only much later, after years of reflection and experience, that Edmund would come to understand the violence inherent in such casual giving, the way that even kindness could be a form of control when it came from someone with power over your survival. For now, he simply felt pleased with himself. He felt as though he had done something noble, something that satisfied some need in himself to believe that he was a good man, a fair lord, a person worthy of the power that God had given him. He did not feel the complexity of what he had set in motion. He felt only the warm glow of having acted virtuously, having made a gesture toward compassion. He spent the rest of the day moving through the manor, checking on various preparations, speaking briefly with his steward about the logistics of the feast, overseeing the arrival of the minstrel who would provide entertainment. In the late afternoon, as the light was fading from the sky, he withdrew to his solar and found himself drawn once again to the window that looked out over his lands. The snow was falling again, heavier now, piling up in great drifts against the walls and the trees. Somewhere out there was the cottage where Gwen lived. He could not see it from this vantage point. It was too far away, hidden by the curve of the land and the trees that bordered the manor's holdings. But he thought of it, thought of her finding the package of food, thought of whatever her reaction might be. He imagined her opening the cloth, discovering the cheese and bread and dried fruit, imagining perhaps the moment of realization that someone had thought of her, that someone had decided she was worth giving to. It occurred to him that he did not actually know her at all. He did not know what she was like beyond the steward's brief description of her work. He did not know if she was intelligent or simple, if she was kind or sour, if she had hopes and ambitions, or if she was simply trying to survive day to day. He did not know if she was lonely or if she preferred solitude. He did not know the most basic things about her, and yet he had made a decision that affected her, had extended his power and his attention to her in a way that he had not really thought through. This realization troubled him slightly, in a way that he immediately pushed aside. It was too complex, too uncomfortable. He preferred not to think about it. Instead, he thought about the feast, about the abundance of food that would be displayed in his great hall, about the pleasure he would feel seeing his tenants eat well for one day, about the way that this pleasure was inseparable from the exercise of his power, from his ability to give and withhold. He thought about how good it would feel to be praised for his generosity, to hear the gratitude in people's voices, to know that he had done his duty and done it well. And somewhere in that thought was the image of Gwen's face, though he had no real idea what her face looked like, having barely registered her existence before the steward's mention. He imagined it as a face that would show gratitude when she received the food, that would glow with appreciation for his kindness. He imagined that she would know, somehow, that it was he who had sent it, and that she would feel a debt of gratitude toward him that would give him some satisfaction, some sense that his lordship meant something beyond the mere extraction of labor and obedience. What he could not imagine, what his privileged mind had no framework for imagining, was that the gift might be complicated for her, that it might raise questions she could not answer, that it might make her feel vulnerable and exposed in ways she did not welcome, that it might be terrifying rather than comforting. He could not imagine that sometimes kindness, when it comes from someone with power over you, can feel like a threat rather than a gift. He could not imagine that Gwen might spend the night awake, trying to figure out what the gift meant, and whether accepting it would put her in danger, whether it would create expectations she could not meet, whether there was some hidden cost to this sudden attention that she could not yet perceive. The evening deepened around both of them, the lord in his manor and the peasant in her cottage, both caught in their own thoughts, both lying awake in their separate beds, though for very different reasons, both contemplating the approaching feast and what it might mean, both standing on the edge of a precipice without quite realizing it. The next morning came gray and cold, with the snow lying thick on the ground and a wind that cut through clothing like a knife. Gwen emerged from her cottage to find the world transformed into a landscape of white that was almost painfully bright, even under the gray sky. Her breath froze in front of her face in thick clouds. The trees were weighted down with snow, their branches drooping under the burden. Even the usually muddy paths of the village had been transformed into clean white roads that seemed to lead to nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. She had work at the manor again today, assigned to help with the butchering of the animals that would be served at the feast. This work was less pleasant than kitchen work. It was bloody and necessary and required strength, and a certain amount of detachment that Gwen had learned to cultivate. She did not like killing, did not like the moment when the animal's life left its body, did not like the smell of blood and exposed flesh. But it was work that needed to be done, and she had learned to do it without flinching, had learned to focus on the practical aspects of the task rather than on the moral weight of it. On her way to the manor, she encountered old Tom, the neighbor whose field boundary she had lost in the dispute with the steward. He was an elderly man, perhaps 60 years old, bent with age and years of labor, his face mapped with lines and his hands gnarled like roots. He was standing at the side of the road, looking at something in the snow, and Gwen almost passed him by without stopping. But something made her pause, some small instinct that whispered that he needed help. "Are you well, Tom?" she called out to him. He looked up, seeming to register her presence with some difficulty, as if his mind had been very far away. "It's the frost," he said. "Look at it." He pointed at the ground. Gwen came closer and saw what he was looking at. There in the snow was a pattern of frost crystals, geometric and impossibly complex, forming shapes that looked almost like writing or like flowers, or like lace that some fairy hand had woven in the night. It was beautiful in a way that Gwen had not expected, beauty that came from nature without any human intervention, beauty that was purely functional. The frost crystals formed this way simply because of the laws of physics and chemistry, and yet seemed to transcend function and reach toward art. "It's lovely," she said simply. Tom nodded slowly. "I have seen many winters," he said, "and each one shows me new things. The world is far stranger than we give it credit for. Even in the cold and snow, there is beauty." He turned to her with eyes that seemed to look at her very carefully. "You are a thoughtful girl, Gwen. You stop to look, most do not. Most would hurry by as if beauty was not worth their time." They stood together in the snow for a moment, looking at the frost patterns, and Gwen felt something loosen in her chest, felt some small weight lift. It was a small moment, nothing significant in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered. It mattered that someone had noticed her, that someone had chosen to share a moment of beauty with her, that someone recognized in her a capacity for appreciation that went beyond mere survival. "Thank you," she said to Tom, "for showing me." He smiled, a smile that revealed he was missing several teeth, but that was genuine nonetheless. "The world is hard," he said. "But if we do not notice the beautiful things, what is the point of enduring at all? I have lost much in my life, Gwen. Family, youth, comfort. But I still see these frost patterns each winter, and that is enough to make me grateful for another day." Gwen walked the rest of the way to the manor with his words in her mind, turning them over like something precious, like the dried fruit hidden in her cottage wall. It seemed to her that Tom was telling her something important, something about how to survive with your soul intact, how to hold onto something even when the world was trying to take everything away from you. The work at the manor that day was exhausting and unpleasant in the way she had anticipated. The animals to be butchered were already dead, hanging from great hooks in the cold storage, and the work was simply the business of breaking them down into usable parts. It was technical work, requiring knowledge of where the joints were, how to cut efficiently to minimize waste, how to separate the valuable parts from the offal. Gwen worked methodically, her hands growing numb despite the work, her arms aching from the effort. Oswin moved around the kitchen, directing the work, occasionally offering criticism when someone was not cutting efficiently. "The Lord wants everything to be perfect," he said at one point. "Everything is to be of the highest quality. There is to be no waste, no shortcuts. We are preparing a feast fit for nobility, and I will not have it done sloppily." This statement, which under normal circumstances would have been merely the cook's professional pride, seemed to carry extra weight in the context of what Gwen had heard about Edmund's particular attention to the feast this year. She wondered again what had changed, what had prompted this emphasis on quality and care. She wondered if it was connected to her gift, if Edmund, for she was now assuming it was Edmund who had sent it, though she had no real proof, had decided to elevate the feast generally, or if it was something separate. By the time her work day ended, Gwen was exhausted and hungry and wanted nothing more than to return to her cottage and sit by the fire. But as she was preparing to leave, Oswin called her name. "Gwen, wait a moment," he said. She came over to where he stood, and he handed her a parcel wrapped in cloth. "The Lord's orders," he said. "Extra rations for the workers who have been helpful with the feast preparations. This is good work you have done. It should not go unnoticed." She took the parcel, feeling its weight, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. Another gift, another sign that she was being watched, that she was being noticed in ways she did not fully understand. She wanted to ask Oswin what this meant, whether the Lord had specifically mentioned her, whether she should be concerned or grateful. But she simply nodded and thanked him, taking the parcel and wrapping it carefully to protect it on the walk home. The parcel, when she opened it in the privacy of her cottage, contained bread and a portion of meat that had clearly come from the butchering, fresh meat that was still warm, along with herbs and salt for flavoring it. It was a tremendous amount of food, far more than she would normally have in an entire week. She sat and stared at it for a long time, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand what this meant, what obligation it created, what expectations it might raise. She cooked the meat carefully in her small pot, the smell of it filling the cottage, and she ate it with bread and found that it was the most delicious thing she had eaten in years. The richness of it, the satisfaction of it, the way it filled her belly and made her feel almost drunk with the pleasure of adequate food. It was almost overwhelming. She had forgotten what it felt like to be truly full, to eat something that nourished not just the body but the spirit as well. But even as she ate, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. This was too much. This was not normal. Something was happening, and she did not understand what it was. Gifts this generous did not come without strings. There was no such thing as free kindness in the world she lived in. Everything was transaction, exchange, obligation. And yet she did not see what the cost could be. What could she possibly offer Lord Ashford in exchange for meat and bread and cheese and dried fruit? What could a landless girl, with nothing offer to a lord with everything? She settled into her bed that night with a full belly for the first time in months, and she found that the fullness made sleep impossible. Her mind raced, turning over possibilities, examining the situation from every angle, trying to find the hidden danger that she was certain must exist somewhere. She lay awake until nearly dawn, and when she finally slipped into sleep, her dreams were vivid and strange, filled with images of feasting and starving, of kindness and betrayal, of a world that was beginning to shift in ways she could not predict or control. By the 13th of December, the village was fully engaged in the preparations for Christmas. The feast was only 2 days away now, and there was an electric quality to the air, a sense of something momentous approaching. The church had been decorated with greenery and evergreen boughs that filled it with the sharp, clean smell of pine and holly. The bell had been polished until it gleamed in the rare moments when the sun broke through the clouds. The priest had announced that there would be a special blessing on Christmas morning, that the service would be longer than usual, that everyone was expected to attend in their best clothing. For those who had the best clothing, this was manageable. For most of the villagers, including Gwen, it meant simply washing what they had and hoping it was clean enough to pass muster. Gwen had spent the evening before scrubbing her one good dress in water so cold it made her fingers ache, using soap that she had made herself from lard and lye, rubbing the fabric between her hands until her knuckles were raw. She had hung it by the fire to dry, and now it hung slightly stiff from the heat, but it was clean, and in the uncertain light of her cottage, it looked almost presentable. The mysterious gifts had continued. Every day for the past 2 days, she had found food waiting for her. Once, a portion of salted fish and an apple. Another time, bread and a small measure of honey that was so precious she had almost wept when she saw it. She had begun to accept that something extraordinary was happening in her life, though she still could not articulate what it was. She had stopped trying to understand it and had simply begun to receive it, storing the food carefully, allowing herself to eat a bit more than usual, noticing how her energy had increased, how the constant low-level ache of hunger had begun to diminish. It was on the afternoon of the 13th that she encountered Edmund Ashford directly for the first time since she was a small child. She had gone to the manor as usual for her day of work, this time assigned to help with the final preparations of the feast foods. The kitchen was in complete chaos, with activity seeming to occur in all directions at once. Meat was being prepared. Elaborate sauces were being made with spices that filled the air with aromas so complex and foreign that Gwen could barely parse them. There was cinnamon and clove and nutmeg, pepper and ginger and saffron, spices that came from lands so distant and foreign that they seemed almost magical in their existence. Oswin was orchestrating it all with the intensity of a general commanding an army, and the permanent household staff and day workers moved in a coordinated dance that somehow managed to be efficient despite appearing chaotic. Gwen had been assigned to work with the sauces, helping to grind spices and mix them into the bases that Oswin was preparing. It was delicate work, requiring precision and attention, and she was grateful for it, grateful to have work that engaged her mind as well as her hands. She was so focused on what she was doing, grinding cloves with a mortar and pestle that Oswin had given her, that she did not immediately notice when the activity in the kitchen shifted, when people began to straighten and quiet themselves. She looked up to find Edmund Ashford standing in the kitchen, observing the work with what appeared to be genuine interest. He was a man of average height, she noticed, neither particularly tall nor short. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but it was a bearing that seemed slightly uncomfortable to him, as if he had not fully settled into the role he occupied. His face was broad and pleasant rather than handsome, with eyes that were a light gray blue, observant and somewhat sad. He was dressed in fine wool and linen, clothing that marked his status far more effectively than any title could have done. His hands were soft, the hands of someone who did not do manual labor. "Oswin," Edmund said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who did not need to shout to be heard. "The preparations look excellent. Tell me, what is the current estimate for the feast? Will we have enough for all our guests?" Oswin immediately moved to his lord's side, his entire demeanor shifting to something more deferential. "Yes, my lord. More than enough. We have planned for provisions that will ensure that everyone in the village can eat well, and that there will be sufficient to impress your noble guests. The quality of what we are preparing is exceptional this year. You should be very pleased with the feast." Edmund nodded slowly, and then, to Gwen's shock, he turned to look directly at her. His gaze met hers for just a moment before moving away, but in that moment she felt as though she had been seen by him in a way that she had never been seen by anyone in power before. It was not a lustful gaze or a cruel one. It was simply attention, recognition, the acknowledgement of another human being. "And who is this?" Edmund asked, gesturing toward Gwen. Oswin followed the direction of his gaze. "This is Gwen, my lord, the tenant's daughter I mentioned to your steward. She works very efficiently and does not complain. She has been particularly helpful with the feast preparations." Edmund turned back to Gwen. "Gwen, yes, I have heard you mentioned. You do good work, I understand." Gwen felt her face flush, felt her heart pounding in her chest. She was aware suddenly of how she must look to him, her hair still somewhat unkempt despite her efforts, her hands stained from the work, her dress worn and humble. She curtsied, a gesture she had learned as a child, her knees bending in the formal obeisance that a peasant gave to nobility. "I do my best, my lord," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund watched her for another moment, and then he nodded. "Well, continue with your work. I can see that you are needed here." He turned away, his attention already moving to other aspects of the kitchen, but the moment had happened, and it had changed something, though Gwen could not quite articulate what. After Edmund had left the kitchen, returning to whatever lordly concerns occupied him, the workers slowly resumed their activity, the tension that had pervaded the space during his presence beginning to dissipate. But Oswin came to Gwen and looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. "He sent the food," Oswin said quietly, his voice low enough that only Gwen could hear. "The Lord wanted you to have extra provisions. He said it was because of your work, because you work hard without complaint, because you deserve better than what you have. I should not tell you this. He did not ask me to, but I thought you should know. Sometimes people need to know that their effort is being noticed." Gwen felt something break open in her chest, felt tears rise to her eyes unbidden. The food had been from Edmund. It was not a mistake or an accident. It was intentional. It was a choice that he had made. And while she still did not entirely understand his motivation, while she still felt the strange complexity of receiving kindness from someone who held power over her survival, at least now she knew. At least now she understood. "Thank you," she whispered to Oswin, and he patted her shoulder once, an awkward gesture of comfort, before moving away to attend to other aspects of the feast preparations. The rest of the day passed in a sort of daze. Gwen's hands continued to work, grinding spices, mixing sauces, preparing vegetables. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over the interaction with Edmund, trying to understand what it meant. She found herself thinking about him differently now, not as an abstract figure of authority, but as a man, a person who had made a choice to notice her, to extend kindness to her. It humanized him in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. It would have been easier to maintain the absolute gulf between them if he had remained entirely abstract, if she could have continued to think of him as simply the Lord, a function rather than a person. As evening was falling and she was preparing to leave the manor, she encountered the steward in the passageway outside the kitchen. He was a thin, narrow-eyed man named Cuthbert, and he had always treated her with a sort of cool indifference, neither kind nor cruel, simply professional in his distance. "Gwen," he said, stopping her, "I wanted to speak with you. The Lord has requested that you serve at the feast on Christmas Day. You will stand in the kitchen portion of the great hall, helping to serve the food to the diners. It is a position of some responsibility. You will be expected to conduct yourself with propriety and efficiency. Can you do this? Gwen felt her breath catch. Serving at the feast meant she would not simply be eating as one of the tenants. She would be part of the manor's household for the day. It was an honor, certainly, but it was also something else. It was a continuation of Edmund's attention, a further elevation of her status, a deepening of whatever pattern was beginning to form. "Yes, my lord steward," she said. "I can do this. I will do it well." The steward nodded. "Good. Come to the manor on Christmas morning before the sun has fully risen. You will be given clothing appropriate to the position and instructions on your duties. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord steward. I understand." She walked back to her cottage in the gathering darkness, the snow crunching beneath her feet, the cold biting at her face. Her mind was whirling with the implications of what had been asked of her. She would be inside the great hall on Christmas. She would see the feast in its full glory, would be close to the fire and the warmth, and would serve the people who sat at the tables. It was an extraordinary opportunity, and it terrified her. That night she lay awake again, but this time it was not from the unsettled feeling of receiving gifts from an unknown source. This time it was from the jolt of energy that came with the knowledge that her life was changing, that something significant was happening, that she was being moved from the edges of society toward something closer to the center, even if only temporarily. She thought about what Tom had said to her about beauty, about holding onto something even when the world was taking everything away. She thought about how the frost patterns could exist even in the depths of winter, how beauty could persist even in hardship. She thought about how kindness, when it came, should perhaps be accepted with gratitude rather than suspicion, even if she did not fully understand it. She thought about Edmund Ashford, a man who had somehow decided that she was worthy of his attention, and what that might mean. The world was still cold, still harsh, still full of hunger and difficulty, but something in it had shifted. Something had changed when Edmund had noticed her, had decided that her labor merited extra compensation, had arranged for her to have a place at the feast as something more than a mere recipient of charity. It was not a cure for all her suffering. It was not a solution to the inequality that defined her life, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall, a place where light could enter, a sign that perhaps the world was not quite as immovable and absolute as she had believed. She rose the next morning, December 14th, with a sense of purpose that she had not felt in a long time. There was work to do, preparations to make, a role to prepare for. Christmas was only one day away now. The feast was almost upon them. And in that feast, something would happen that neither she nor Edmund could yet fully predict, something that would arise from the collision of these two worlds, the world of privilege and the world of deprivation, the world of the lord and the world of the peasant, brought together for one day in the ancient ritual of Christmas generosity and human connection. She ate a small portion of the bread and honey that had been left for her the day before, and then she set about preparing herself. She washed her face and hands in water that had been heated by the fire. She combed her hair as much as she could with her fingers, trying to bring order to it. She rehearsed in her mind how she would stand, how she would move, how she would carry herself. She would need to be unobtrusive but present, efficient but respectful, part of the household but still separate from it. It was a delicate balance, and she was determined to strike it perfectly. As the day wore on and evening approached, she found herself thinking about her parents, about what they would have made of this moment in her life. Her father, she thought, would have been proud of her for working hard, for catching the attention of the Lord through her diligence. Her mother would have been worried about her, would have counseled caution, would have reminded her that kindness from the powerful could be a double-edged sword. But her parents were gone, and she was here, alone in the world except for the strange attention that Edmund had decided to pay her. She settled into her bed that night with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She slept more peacefully than she had in days, and her dreams were filled with images of great fires and tables laden with food, of music and dancing and the smell of spiced wine, of a world that was larger and more generous than the narrow world of survival that had defined her existence for so long. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The day after tomorrow was the feast, the Christmas day, the day when the two worlds would come together in the great hall, when everything would be transformed, if only briefly, into something different. She did not know it yet, but the next 2 days would contain events that would change not just her life, but Edmund's as well. And in the collision of their two worlds, in the breaking down of the barriers that separated them, something new would be born. Something that neither of them could have anticipated, something that would ripple outward through the village and beyond, touching lives and changing trajectories in ways that would only become clear much later, after the feast was over and the crisis had come.